Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm James Woolcock. Now, it's that dreaded time of the year for parents. A-level results are out on Thursday.
Arguably for students as well, I suppose. Not just parents going to be stressed out by A-level results.
So when I got mine, my mum was far more stressed than I was. Maybe that sort of helped with the fear.
Always so zen on these issues.
I mean, see, if you want to get an idea of what real trauma looks like, I had no kind of technical issues, whereas Scotland, they released results of their hires last week. A technical issue had thousands of teenagers getting just a blank email.
Oof.
I think the not unknown is actually worse.
I kind of tend to agree. I mean, speaking of another story that we're focusing on today and the perhaps as yet unknown effects of a key Labour policy around education. It's got plenty of parents worried, and this is adding VAT to private school fees, effectively upping the costs by around 20%. The tax will apply to all payments for the January term made from the 29th of July, so just a few days ago. Only 7% of British people are privately educated, but almost 40% of those in top roles in politics, business and media.
So the tax on private school fees was, for some, the most controversial part of Labour's election manifesto. But the policy has raised questions around the future of these schools, on social mobility, and lots of other hot-button issues. It certainly has caused a lot of controversy and, I mean, some would say even hysteria from some of the voices you hear about this kind of debate. So Bloomberg's latest reporting on the subject shows that there has been a jump in demand from financial advisors as to how to best handle the tax changes.
Well, let's bring in our finance reporter, Charlotte Hughes-Morgan, who's been covering this story for some time here at Bloomberg. Charlotte, welcome. Can you just, first of all, remind us exactly what is changing when it comes to private school fees?
Of course. So, I mean, Labour have long said that they're going to kind of levy a tax on private school fees, which so far parents haven't had to pay value-added tax on school fees. But from the 1st of January 2025, Labour have said we're removing the private schools' tax-exempt status. So from the beginning of next year, there will be a 20% VAT on private school fees for parents in the UK. Now, as you mentioned, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how much of that 20% will actually be passed on to parents. You know, you've got some schools saying that we'll pass on, the full amount, but there's still a lot up in the air about whether parents will actually be hit with a straight 20% from January next year.
So if you were to listen to Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, my God, now, she would be saying this money, which is, I think, roughly £1.5 billion, is there to fill the fiscal hole. But if you were to go back to September 2021, Keir Starmer, now Prime Minister, was talking about rebalancing the educational system. So why is the government doing this?
I mean, ostensibly, as you say, yes, Labour have said we need to improve education for all, and they're saying that this money raised from the VAT will go to fund more teachers for the state school system. You know, you've got a lot of state schools under pressure, staff shortages. The unions kind of have said there's a really crisis in state schools. So Labour is saying, look, this money is going into state schools, which most of the UK school children are educated in the government-funded state sector. So you've got that, but on the other hand, you've got this education system in the UK is so interesting, and there's this kind of whole fairness debate. Left-wing politicians have often kind of seen the UK's private school system as this bastion of social inequality. It really is seen to entrench these kind of things around class and status in the UK. You've got a lot of people who come through the private school system and go on to the top jobs in politics, in media, in business in the UK. So Labour have often said we need to kind of level this playing field, and they've had private schools in their sights for quite some time. So you've got these two elements, improving the state sector, but also kind of cracking down on the unfairness inherent in the UK system.
What have schools that you've been speaking to, Charlotte, said they're going to do about this tax increase?
So it really ranges. You've got the big brand schools, Eton, Harrow, Marlborough. At that end, really, they've got these massive financial endowments, and in general, the thoughts are that they will be fine, and they might even be able to kind of shield parents from that kind of 20% increase because they've just got the resources. Now, the schools we spoke to that were really worried about this were the kind of smaller independent schools, and we forget a lot of fee-paying schools are actually quite small and unknown. You've got schools all around the country, about 200 pupils, 300 pupils, who operate on quite tight margins, and they were really quite worried because they're saying, look, we don't have the resources, we're going to have to pass on this 20% to parents. And some parents said, well, we're not going to be able to afford that. We're going to have to take our children out of the school. Some of the headmasters we spoke to said enrolment's gone down. And ultimately, schools operate like businesses, so they will have to make cuts in certain areas. They might have to scrap things like bursaries or scholarships for the slightly less wealthy children. So lots of schools are quite concerned about this, but the big schools that you tend to think about when you think about private schools, probably going to be fine.
Well, so we've talked about the schools. We've heard lots of warnings about what parents might do, especially parents on the margins who might lose out. Now, you've been reporting on some of the decisions that parents are making. What are you hearing parents are doing?
I mean, you're right. There's been a lot of fear-mongering in the press, I have to say. We're going to have parents yanking their children out and an influx into the state sector. I mean, what we found when we were reporting for the latest piece was that parents are consulting their financial advisors. So they're clearly thinking about it. They're kind of looking at their finances and thinking, how am I going to make this work if I'm going to make this work? And there are lots of different things people are thinking about doing, right? You've got some people who are saying, OK, well, maybe I will go state educated for my children at primary school, but save up and try and go private for secondary school or sixth form. So you've got that kind of pick and mix approach. You've got some parents who are saying, well, look, this 20% or 15% or whatever is being passed on to me is kind of the tip of the iceberg. What I'm going to do is try and send my child to a really good performing state school or even a grammar school, areas like Kent and Buckinghamshire have got grammar schools that are academically selective but not fee paying. So you've got parents thinking, okay, well, maybe I will move to an area even that has a good state school in and try and get my child into that, or pay for private tutoring and get a place at a grammar school. So people are thinking of workarounds, and the kind of obvious ones as well are things like asking grandparents for help and ultimately moving out of the private school sector. So parents are thinking about ways to manage this kind of financial hit.
Yeah, and as you say, we don't quite yet know what proportion of parents will decide to make those decisions about changing schools or putting their children into state schools instead. So the consequences of this policy are still, I suppose, to be seen in the future. But there are other knock-on effects. You alluded to one there. Property prices, I'm sure, are going to be affected by people moving to areas that have good schools. Already very much a plus when people are looking at areas to live in. What are the sorts of knock-on effects of this policy having?
I mean, totally. And it does sound quite extreme, doesn't it? I'm going to move house to get my kid into a school. But these are people's children. They've got skin in the game. People are really kind of concerned about their welfare. So, yeah, and it's interesting when you look at some of the best performing state schools in the UK, house prices are, they're much higher often than in other areas. There's a school in Kent called Cranbrook, which is one of the only kind of boarding state schools and very kind of high performing, and I had a little look at their property prices around there, and they go in the catchment area, which is the area you need to live in order to send your child to this school. There's like a 67% premium on house prices compared to the rest of the county. So yeah, parents, you might well see, and again, as you said, it's a bit of kind of crystal ball gazing. This hasn't come into effect yet, but you might see house prices spike in those areas. And as we mentioned at the top, there is a bit of hysteria around this. There's a lot of people say that the state school system is going to be overwhelmed with all these pupils. I personally am a bit sceptical about that, and I know some others are. We need to kind of see what the lay of the land looks like before we start kind of worrying about state schools being overwhelmed. You might see it, but you might also see parents kind of absorb these higher fees however they can. So there will be knock-on effects, but it remains to be seen kind of how drastically this changes kind of education system in the UK.
So you've spelled out kind of a few of the pros and the cons. You know that although parents are asking about it, we're yet to see exactly how many will really vote with their feet. But certainly there's a lot of upset, which you've also alluded to. So could you help us understand, of all the things Labour have announced, this has been one of the most hot button issues. We saw there was a point during the election campaign where Greg Hands, who was a former Conservative minister, former party chair, was told off for putting in a parents' WhatsApp group campaigning lines about schools, where some parents, and he went to a fee-paying school, his kids were going to a fee-paying school, said, actually, we would quite like a debate about equity in education. So it goes both ways. But why has education and private school education become such a controversial issue around the UK? And especially for parents and questions around sort of social mobility.
It's actually a really, interesting area, because the reason it's controversial is private schools themselves are controversial. We have a kind of a very two-tier system in the UK. You've got 7% of school children educating at these fee-paying schools. But, there's a recent report, I think in 2019, a report carried out by the Social Mobility Commission showed that 40% of those in the top jobs come from private schools. So there's this kind of inherent kind of debate about UK society and the way it's kind of slightly unfairly structured. That is kind of at the heart of the controversy here. I think also on a more kind of personal level, you've got, these are people's children, and a lot of parents will say, look, I don't even like the fact that there's this kind of divide between private and state school, but I want to do the best I can for my children. So, what else am I going to do? If I have the money, I'm going to try and send them to private schools. So you've got, these are, people have skin in this game. And I think people are worried about the disruption to their children's education. And they see private schools as, like you see, I suppose, private healthcare. It's an alternative to the government funded system. And so people then feel that it's unfair that they should have to kind of pay this VAT on education. On the other hand, we talk about this a lot. Should we get a tiny violin out for the 7% of school children who are lucky enough to afford fee-paying education? Lots would say, and lots in the Labour Party, I think Rachel Reeves said, why are people so obsessed with privately educated school children? For some people, it's like, well, majority of people go through the state system. So why is the state system not good enough for these school children too? So there's a lot at play here, and it's a very uniquely British entanglement of class and status and money. So lots to be kind of unpicked as we see how it actually plays out.
Charlotte, what about the question of the future of private schools, which are, as you've mentioned, these are businesses we're talking about in the UK. They're also businesses that are internationally quite successful for the UK too. Does that sector become damaged by this change?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, education, private education, particularly a huge export for the UK, really. A lot of people think of Eton, Harrow, these kind of big boarding schools as the kind of best educators in the world, really. It's interesting. Some people we spoke to for the piece said, yes, this does definitely tarnish the UK's reputation as a kind of gold standard. But others are saying, look, the people that come from around the world to these schools, they're high net worth individuals. This fee increase, will it affect them? Will it kind of be as much of a consideration for people who are kind of sending their children halfway across the world? Arguably not, but there was a concern that this would make us less competitive in the global market. And you've got these kind of big boarding schools in, say, Switzerland, around the world, and people may say, well, look, this is a significant price increase. I'm going to see what else is out there. I'm not just going to default come to the UK. But I think the general consensus is that private schools, fees have gone up, I think 55% in real terms since 2003, and somehow pupil numbers haven't gone down. Parents have absorbed the fees. There's seemingly unceasing demand for some of these big brand schools. So I not sure.
Difficult to tell,
yeah, I'm not sure it'll be kind of, an overwhelming kind of exodus away from UK education.
Okay, Charlotte Hughes-Morgan, our finance reporter, thanks very much for bringing us the ins and outs of this interesting story around the education sector in the UK. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Grastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.